Good morning and good afternoon and a very warm welcome. My name is Helena Hahn. I'm a junior policy analyst within the European Policy Center European Migration and Diversity Program, and I'm delighted to be moderating today's online policy dialogue, Biden and the EU, a turning point in transatlantic cooperation on migration. I would also like to use this opportunity to thank our partners, the US mission to the European Union, for their excellent support for this event, which is both timely and topical for several reasons. Under the previous US administration, we saw declining engagement from multilateral fora, including in the realms of migration, asylum, as well as development and humanitarian causes. Then and now, it has become clear that there are growing global challenges that will require joint efforts. With the Biden-Harris administration in office, now is the time to consider what these could and should look like. Of course, several challenges have to be considered. There are protracted conflicts as well as humanitarian emergencies that remain unresolved until today. We also see that climate change and the ensuing loss of livelihoods further continue to contribute to the factors that drive people from their homes, notably amongst others in the Sahel region, as well as the Northern Triangle. And as a result, we're also seeing growing resettlement needs, estimated to be at no less than 1.47 million by UNHCR, an increase of 30,000 compared to last year. Most of the persons in need hail from Syria, the Democratic Republic of Congo, South Sudan, and Afghanistan, which comes as no surprise given the worsening security situations and instability in these places. Finally, we have also seen that derogations in practice from the principles of international protection enshrined in the Geneva Convention have once again come under the spotlight recently. Now, both the US and the EU have taken steps to address these issues. The EU is in the midst of negotiations on the new pact of asylum, on migration and asylum, while the Biden-Harris administration presented an ambitious and comprehensive reform package early on in their presidency. Both sides are faced with challenge to find internal consensus while simultaneously making firm commitments to solidarity with countries of origin, transit, and host communities. As many of you may be aware, the US and the EU have also begun rebuilding transatlantic cooperation. At the EU-US summit on June 15th, they resolved to revive a dialogue on migration and mobility and to find innovative solutions on effective and safe migration policy in cooperation with third countries, including via the US-EU platform on migration and asylum. And just last week, ministers from both sides confirmed their commitment to ensuring humane and well-managed migration. Against this background, I'm very pleased to welcome our excellent set of speakers and to hear their views on what priorities future transatlantic cooperation should focus on, what opportunities for better policy alignment there may be, as well as where either side can benefit from lessons learned in the fields of migration and asylum. We have with us today Marta, who is Deputy Assistant Secretary at the State Department's Bureau of Population, Refugees and Migration. We also have Johannes Luchner, who is Deputy Director General in charge of Horizontal Affairs and Migration at DG Home. And we have Elizabeth Collett, who is Special Advisor to IOM's Director General, Antonio Vitorino. And to provide comments and questions to kickstart our discussion, we have Victoria Rietig, who is the head of the migration program at the German Council on Foreign Relations. And last, but certainly not least, we have Jennifer Sime, who is Senior Vice President in charge of resettlement, asylum, and integration with the International Rescue Committee. Thank you to all for making the time to join us today. Now, before we begin, a few brief words on housekeeping. Panel speakers will provide initial statements for about 7 to 8 minutes. Then I will turn to the respondents, who will speak for about 4 minutes. Then I will turn again to the speakers to provide some initial and brief reactions, and then we will dedicate the rest of the time to an open Q&A with the audience. If you would like to ask a question, please submit them in writing by using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. You will also have a chance to read them out directly. Now, I'd also kindly like to ask you to keep them as concise as possible and to state your name and affiliation so we know who you are. And then on that note as well, please do consider posting your questions as soon as possible so we can take as many as possible in the Q&A. As a final note, please also note that this event is being recorded and will be available online shortly thereafter. Now, without further ado, I'd like to hand over to our first speaker. Marta, we're really delighted to have you with us today to share the State Department's view on future cooperation on migration in this transatlantic realm. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Helena. I really, on behalf of the State Department, I really much appreciate the invitation to join this esteemed group, the program participants, the audience. This is a great group to discuss these topics. I am, of course, prepared to speak on the topic at hand, transatlantic cooperation on migration, but I didn't want to speak to it without taking a moment to outline the Biden administration's approach to migration. As you mentioned, Helena, this new comprehensive and collaborative approach it's very ambitious, and it affects not only our approach to migration challenges in the Western Hemisphere, but it also informs and colors our cooperation with Europe as well. So President Biden, in an executive order he signed in February, outlined this comprehensive approach to promote safe, orderly, and humane migration. And the approach has 4 components. So the first is root causes. And the idea is to address the root causes of irregular migration in the region. The root causes strategy will focus on 3 key areas: governance, economic opportunity, and security. And these get at the core reasons of why people choose to leave their communities. Our efforts include working with partners in the region to combat corruption, promote respect for human rights, labor rights, and free press, to improve security, including combating gender violence and gang networks, and to generate economic opportunities so that people can build safer, more prosperous futures at home. As you've seen in the press, Vice President Harris has taken the lead on the root causes effort. As she indicated during her recent trip to Guatemala, the point of our efforts on root causes is to build opportunities and to build hope. She said that we must convince people that there's a reason to be hopeful about their future and the future of their children. The second part of the comprehensive approach, the second component, is strengthening the cooperative efforts in the region to address migration flows and provide protection. And this is through what we're calling it a collaborative migration management strategy. And no previous administration has called for such a strategy. And while we're still working to finalize the aspects of it, it's a holistic approach by which we work with countries in the region and the international community to ensure that there's not only a surge of humanitarian assistance in the region, but a renewed focus on protections for internally displaced persons so that people can find safety in their own countries and they're not forced to migrate, that there's reintegration support for returnees, that there are temporary worker programs within the region, humane border management and enforcement, and that we work with our partners to help countries in the region build their own stronger asylum systems and processes for integrating refugees in each country so that there are viable options for people to find protection closer to home. The third component is expanding legal pathways for protection and opportunity in the United States. And we've made significant progress here already since February. We've restarted and expanded our family reunification program, CAM, we call it, Central American Minors. And this is so that minors with parents or legal guardians in the United States can be reunited with their parents legally without having to resort to irregular migration. We've also expanded our temporary worker program, and we're working to increase access for refugee resettlement from the region. We've worked to unwind the MPP, which is the Migrant Protection Protocol, which is also kind of commonly known as Remain in Mexico. And we're doing this so that MPP participants are now entering the United States legally so that they can pursue their immigration cases. Our aim through expanding legal pathways is to signal to intending migrants that there are better legal alternatives to irregular migration. And the fourth component is restoring and enhancing access to asylum at the border. We're still grappling with COVID-19 related restrictions at the border, but the Department of Homeland Security is engaged in an ongoing effort to address this part of the President's directive. Now, each of these 4 components is an enormous lift, but we believe that together they'll help build a more stable region and strengthen cooperative efforts to address migrant flows and provide protection, assistance, and legal pathways for those who choose to migrate or are forced to flee. And we hope that ultimately this will reduce irregular migration. And now, transatlantic cooperation on migration. So, as Helena mentioned, we also were very pleased with the June 15th US-EU summit, during which leaders committed to raising the level of ambition in the transatlantic partnership. We welcome the leaders' commitment to revive dialogue on migration and mobility, including via the US-EU platform on migration and asylum. We also welcome possible US participation in the EU's high-level resettlement forum on July 9th. It's important that we jointly highlight international protection issues in both fora. We also note that our previous strong cooperation via the US-EU migration platform is something that we remain especially interested in, and especially in reinvigorating the conversations on migration policy, including on resettlement and cooperation with third countries. We also see MIRPS, which is the Spanish acronym for the Regional Protection and Solutions, the Comprehensive Regional Protection and Solutions Framework. We see MIRPS and its support platforms as vehicles to mobilize a more holistic approach to forced displacement challenges in the region. We appreciate the EU's leadership as a fellow support platform member, and for recently leading an expert roundtable for MIRPS countries on management of large-scale movements of migration, of refugees. The June 10th MIRPS Solidarity event in San Jose, Costa Rica, brought together stakeholders, including donor countries, multilateral development banks, civil society, and private sector entities, to show meaningful support, including in-kind donations, technical assistance, as well as funding. We also believe this is another example of how like-minded countries can work together. Another example is how is committing to increasing refugee resettlement. We're committing allotments of specific visa categories for these populations. We welcome the EU's major financial contributions to addressing the needs of people on the move globally. Together, we think we can best tackle the many humanitarian challenges associated with meeting the needs of those affected by protracted crises. We also note the EU's efforts to improve security and migration management along the EU's external borders, while also retaining its commitment to asylum and respecting the human rights of migrants. As the two largest humanitarian donors globally, US and EU coordination is critical to providing protection and assistance to refugees, displaced persons, and vulnerable migrants. We look forward to continuing our strong US-EU cooperation, including on our shared challenges and priorities. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for these excellent insights and for outlining what is indeed a very ambitious agenda. And thanks also very much for sticking to the time. Johannes, I'm likewise very pleased that you were able to join today, and I'd be very happy to hear the Commission's perspective on what lies ahead for transatlantic cooperation. Please, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Helena. Thanks to you for assembling all these distinguished speakers and guests. You will hopefully not be surprised that I will repeat a lot of what Marta just said, which is natural. But of course, we warmly welcome the new, fresh policy orientation in the US and the opening it brings in EU-US relations, including on subjects like migration. It doesn't come as a complete surprise because, of course, we followed with keen interest the first announcements of then still President-elect Biden. And given the background of both US Secretary of State Blinken and Secretary for Homeland Security Mayorkas, I must say that over the last couple of years, of course, we were regretting the sometimes absence of a like-minded partner, in particular in discussions on migration at the global scale. Now, the first contacts Commissioner Johansson had with Secretary of State Mayorkas in February were already very, very promising. This culminated in the EU-US Justice and Home Affairs Ministerial in Lisbon just recently, where both, I think, joint positive intentions, but also a very positive atmosphere could be seen, and an understanding that the US and the EU, despite the differences in detail and geography, face very, very similar challenges that we address in a similar manner. Marta already mentioned that we want to re-engage in a transatlantic dialogue on migration, including the EU-US migration platform. And personally, I look a lot forward to that because we face common challenges. And I think the exchange of experience would be very, very valuable. Now, we also face, as I said, similar challenges with different migration movements. Another parallelism is that in the EU, as you know, we're in the process of negotiating the legislative proposals that should put in place a truly European asylum and migration management system, otherwise known as the new Pact on Migration and Asylum. And our starting point is similar to that of what President Biden announced for his own administration, namely to build a migration system that is fair, that is orderly, that is humane, and that is well managed. We need, and I think that approach is shared with the United States, we need balanced immigration policies that protect citizens, but that also support national, economic, and societal needs thanks to legal pathways, which should, as Marta has underlined as well, help us reduce irregular migration. And in the case of Europe, due to the natural border that the Mediterranean and the Atlantic constitute, also lead to large-scale tragic loss of life, which of course we want to avoid. Now, the pact is built on three pillars, and I think the most important difference, and there we are at the structural difference between the US and the EU, is of course that in the EU, the main question is the balance between responsibility and solidarity that our member states assume in managing migration. Now, very briefly, if I could go over the main topics that we are focusing on. First, I would mention legal migration. The EU, and that is sometimes overlooked, is a net immigration space. In 2019, we issued more than 3 million first residence permits. Member states issued them to non-EU nationals, of which more than 1 million were for employment. And we're very happy that just recently the co-legislators have reached provisional agreement on the so-called Blue Card Directive, which should allow the EU to become a more attractive space for highly skilled migrants and follow the examples that Canada and the United States have set. Secondly, we are absolutely committed to offering safe and legal pathways for people in need of international protection. Since 2015, more than 80,000 refugees have found a new home in the European Union. These efforts will continue. We are currently working on the preparation of the next resettlement program for 2022. As you know, the current one was rather handicapped by the COVID pandemic, but we want to ensure continuity in resettlement efforts of the EU. And of course, we have observed with great satisfaction the announcement by the US administration and the decision to increase resettlement to 65,000 this fiscal year, and then twice that in fiscal year 2022. As Marta also mentioned on this subject, Commissioner Johannes is organizing a high-level resettlement forum on the 9th of July. And Helena, I think it was you who mentioned the UNHCR number of 1.47 million people to be resettled. It is clear that nobody can shoulder that alone, and that in order to get progress, we have to cooperate with as many countries as we can, and the most important partner in this context is, of course, the United States of America. Third, a greater openness to legal migration also goes hand in hand with return. And there I would just like to emphasize that we want to push very, very hard to increase the share of voluntary returns in overall returns. And that goes together with reintegration programs that need to be financed in third countries, not only for returnees, but also for their communities, exactly to give people a perspective that indeed for them and their children, there is a future where they come from. When it comes to third countries, again, I think the approach is similar, but there are some details where it will be very interesting to have a discussion. Root causes are always high on the agenda. Personally, I come from the development world, and I think that that is a rather medium to long-term effort if you really want to work on that. But it includes other more immediately tangible measures, such as support for border management, for asylum systems, and for legal migration, where we have launched the so-called talent partnerships, where together with member states and with third countries, we want to build opportunities for mobility of students, of graduates, of workers with different sets and levels of skills, while avoiding a brain drain. Now, in conclusion, for all these reasons and on all these subjects, we are extremely happy, and I can say that also personally, I'm extremely happy that we can restart, that we have restarted the US-EU dialogue on migration. We want to be as flexible and open as possible in this dialogue. We want to have open discussions, and of course, as the EU, include the views of our member states, and the EU-US platform will make a significant contribution to that. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Johannes, also for outlining the EU's vision and possible next steps, as well as joint priorities that could be followed up in the coming months and years. Just a quick reminder to everyone in the audience, please do feel free to already continue posting your questions so that we can dive straight into the Q&A after we wrap up with all the speakers. Now, I'd like to turn next to you, Liz. Your role at the IOM, of course, provides you with sort of a wide lens view of migration cooperation on a global level. So I'm wondering, in your view, what opportunities and challenges do you see going forward in terms of strengthening transatlantic cooperation on migration? Please, over to you.
Many thanks, Helena, for the invitation here, and thanks to the EPC. I mean, I think first and foremost, the big takeaway for me is there is so much to say here, that there is such potential for global leadership through transatlantic cooperation and rich exchange as well, and pushing forward some key issues that may have stagnated over the past 5 years. I strongly welcome the comments made about how to approach particularly the external dimension of migration, that the comprehensive approach of bringing together humanitarian response, peace building and development, in order to really think through quite complex movement and mobility of people, in some cases internal displacement, in some cases return and reintegration, and really understanding how to integrate those into each other. Reintegration policies need to be strongly linked to development and peace building. We need to really think about how we manage resettlement in this context. I'm sure Jennifer will speak more to that than I will, and how we build out a mobility perspective in key areas of concern. And there's obviously a natural tendency for different parts of the world to focus on their neighborhood and their backyard. But I think the common threads we see, whether it's the Sahel, whether it's Venezuela, Central America, Afghanistan, we see high levels of instability, highly complex movements, and the multifaceted nature of these requires that deep and sustained investment that we are now seeing, I think, from the US administration in particular, that willingness to say we are going to engage, and we're going to engage in the long term, and that we've seen through recent investments across the EU. I just want to focus my remarks then on a few areas looking forward where a new cooperation might be built. And it's hard to look at many of these areas that take a lot of the focus day to day in terms of migration and displacement, without understanding that climate and climate change and environmental degradation plays a strong underlying role. It's rare that you can source climate as a sole driver of movement, but it is a contributing factor in many of the complexities we see today, whether it's disaster displacement, whether it's people seeking different livelihoods and moving from rural to urban locations. But that complexity is underpinned by quite serious and distinct changes in the environment around us. And here I think we also see the Biden administration taking that very seriously, and certainly pushing for a stronger consideration of that in their own investments, and the executive order that was put out in February of this year, focusing on how we can think more clearly about those aspects. But here I think there's also a real opportunity for transatlantic cooperation, and particularly in the run-up of COP26, which is how do we bring migration, adaptation, and many of those support structures into play, into those discussions at the end of this year, and really think through what kind of multilateral investments and resilience building we can do within communities so that people do not have to move, as well as supporting those on the move, and making sure that we're responding in a humane and practical way. A second area is one that's been sensitive in recent years. Obviously, the Global Compact on Migration was not universally accepted across the world, and in 2018 caused a large amount of debate. Our sense is that the temperature has lowered in terms of international discussions around the Global Compact. We've seen some positive statements, certainly here in Geneva from the US administration, about how useful the framework of the Global Compact can be to help states really think through every single aspect of migration management. And as we go into 2022, in the second half of 2022, there will be an international migration review forum, which will bring all states together to reflect on positive developments to implement the Global Compact. And it is a great opportunity there to really set some priorities and draw out particular objectives. What do we want to see real movement on over the next few years, and think through what that might look like. But I'd just like to finish on an issue that I think is very concerning to IOM, that we do not see really resonating yet in the international discussion, and that is the role of global mobility in post-pandemic recovery. We're all talking about recovering back better, but a lot of the challenges we see in the future in terms of global mobility are related to how we restart and reopen borders in a health-safe manner. Increasingly now, certification is becoming the solution of choice to identify who crosses borders. And our concern is that and any other solutions put in place remain deeply accessible in terms of finance, in terms of people being able to access the vaccinations that might facilitate their movement, in terms of not intruding too much on privacy, but also making sure that partner countries around the world who may not have the sophisticated infrastructure and architecture and civil registries, all the way through to border management practices, are not then left out of the global mobility system because of the arrangements that have been set by a number of governments in terms of access and entry. And I think here we see a number of dangers of creating a two-tier mobility system, both in terms of how vaccination plays out around the world, the inclusion of migrants and displaced populations in vaccination programming. We see a very asymmetric situation around the world. In some countries, huge efforts made, not just on paper, to offer migrants access to vaccinations, but practical measures to overcome vaccine hesitancy, mobile outreach units. I think some of my favorite examples come from the US in that regard. But then also really thinking through what a global mobility system looks like that facilitates rather than creates further asymmetries and inequities. And here I think the US and the EU have a strong global leadership role to play, not least because, I mean, within the EU context, a huge amount of thought has gone into health certification and standards and interoperability. So how do we now take that externally? How do we take that global and really think about how we move back to a mobile world in a context where we may expect pandemics in the future, we may expect shocks in the future, but I think we're all agreed that we shouldn't find ourselves in a situation of uncertainty and chaos again. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Liz. What I'm getting a sense of is that, of course, there's not only issues where, the transatlantic partners can come together in the sense that they may be able to sort of rebuild on issues where they previously cooperated on, but of course that this relationship will necessarily have to take into consideration these global challenges that, extend both, or that apply both to the transatlantic partnership, but also beyond, and that there's, different ways of reaching out and maneuvering. I'd like to turn next to Victoria and then Jennifer. I'd like to invite both of you to provide first reactions. So based on what we heard, do you see any challenges that the Biden-Harris administration as well as the EU may face? And do you also maybe perhaps identify other opportunities for closer engagement that maybe weren't addressed yet sufficiently? So Victoria, over to you.
Thank you very much, Helena, and thanks for the invitation. It's been great listening to the distinguished speakers before, and it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you for letting me comment on what they've said. I think the first takeaway I would have from especially the comments from Marta and Johannes is that if you wanted to put a label over them, you would say sigh of relief. I think that is the label that a lot of transatlanticists have put on the cooperation, on the summits that have happened so far. And that, of course, is not surprising given the last 4 years. Johannes, you said, we warmly welcome the fresh policy perspective of the US, and you particularly emphasized not just the positive intentions that were voiced at the meetings, but also the atmosphere. And I think that is something that transatlanticists have yearned for in a while. So I think that is kind of the main takeaway that is not all that surprising. I want to make 2 or 3 points on what we've heard so far and on opportunities for collaboration in the future and how that's actually going to look in practice when it comes to migration cooperation. So I think one of the question marks that we should have and perhaps discuss here is how broad is our focus actually going to be when it comes to migration cooperation? Because traditionally the migration cooperation focus of EU-US corporations has been on security aspects, of course. Terrorism plays a large role, of course. Exchange of passenger data plays a large role. So all those security aspects play a large role. And that security focus, of course, is also visible if you look at the joint statement that came out of the meeting on June 22nd. And when you have to read for a long, long time until you actually get to all the points that you mentioned in your intro, which are we all want to have humane and effective migration systems that are comprehensive. So this statement from the 22nd really was encouraging because it actually included these more comprehensive aspects of migration and asylum policies, including such things as complementary pathways, of course, including resettlement, and also cooperation with third countries of origin. And I think the question is, now that we're going forward and going to continue those conversations, how is the balance going to be of those priorities in the relationship? That's the first point I wanted to make. A second point I wanted to make on complementary pathways and especially resettlement, which all speakers have touched upon. I think one of the kind of low-hanging fruits in the EU-US cooperation on migration issues is the area of resettlement. We've heard a lot of movement around pledges to increase resettlement numbers, of course, by the Biden-Harris administration, but we've also seen some movement happening in the European Union on that. So I think that is a very promising area that I'm sure Jennifer is going to talk about. Let me just add, as some shameless self-promotion, the 2 points here. One that we at DJP have called for a joint EU-US resettlement action in a paper that we put out in February, unfortunately in German, sorry about that. And we've also, I as a member of Germany's expert commission on root causes, have also called for a resettlement coalition between the US, Germany, other European countries, potentially Japan. And the concrete thing that we've put forward is that each member of such a resettlement coalition should at least pledge to resettle 0.05% of their population per year. So for Germany, that would be about 40,000 people. So this has already been picked up by a few politicians in Germany, for instance, the Green politician Cem Özdemir. So do expect some news to come out of Germany on that. I think in the next few months, it's going to be a debate. And of course, we should also keep watching the 9 July Forum on Resettlement. The third point I want to make is one that perhaps is going to dampen our mood a little bit. And you said, well, what are the challenges going to be? Because so far we've talked about the great opportunities and all the things that we can do potentially together. But I do want to point out one elephant in the room that always is there whenever we discuss US-EU cooperation on migration. And that is that, at least in my experience, I've seen that most transatlanticists simply do not care much for migration. And I have to kind of point out here on a personal note, I've been working on migration for about 15 years, about half of that in the United States, half of that in Germany. So I've kind of, I've been plugged into the debates in both countries. And as Johannes said earlier, the parallels are quite astonishing. The parallels in our challenges, but also how we've been reacting to them is astonishing. But most people really don't see that that way and would disagree with that. And I think that has various reasons. To a lot of transatlanticists, migration is a soft topic. Transatlanticists historically have been more trade focused or security focused, or to many of them, it's a limited topic. They view it through the security lens, or it's also a fashion topic, something that a lot of them think, well, it's going to go away. So I think the elephant in the room for me is, okay, there is now movement that is wonderful. Let's all try and support that. But I do want to caution us all a little bit and just ask, how long is this joint interest going to last this time? And how are you going to get the people on board that traditionally have been hesitant on that? I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks very much for sharing your insights, Victoria. I'm sure the speakers will have quite a couple of things to pick up on here. But before I turn to them, Jennifer, I'd be very happy to also hear your comments and any questions that you might have. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And thank you for having me here today. So first of all, I'd like to say that definitely very excited about the new policies from the Biden administration. I think it's great to see the US government again engage on these issues. And I think all the speakers have spoken to that, and that's a clear area of agreement. Another area that I was very pleased to hear people talk about is the reference to climate change, because we definitely hear from many of the refugees coming into the United States and even IDPs and other parts of the world where IRC works, that the effects of climate change are very much a contributing factor to people's decisions on moving across borders and even in terms of internal displacement. A couple of points that I want to make. I think the first one, and I would like to hear the speakers talk a little bit more about the asylum system, because one of the first areas that we do need to look at, I think both in the US and in Europe, is around asylum. In the United States specifically, we still have Title 42 in place. I know DHS is looking at different ways to try to remove that. But that is still happening, and there have been at least 100,000 expulsions in the southern border. So that is something that needs to be looked at, and it is not right to be using public health as a way to prevent people from coming into the country. On the European side, we still have this terrible situation in Greece with the camps in the islands. That I think is another area that is that really needs to be looked at, and where there needs to be a way to solve this. There are thousands of people in camps that are really not well functioning, and that can and are having long-term impacts on the people who are there in terms of both their physical and their mental health. So I think the asylum area is one of focus. I also wanted to pick up a little bit on the comments about aid, which I think absolutely is necessary to address the root causes, both in Central America and in other locations. But I think we need to make sure that there is a distinction in terms of the types of aid, and that this aid is in fact going to strengthen their institutions, to provide economic opportunity, to ensure that these countries can move forward in their path, as opposed to ensuring that there are better border controls or that different entities or parts of those governments are actually better set to prevent people from moving and crossing borders. Because let's remember that that is a right that people have to cross the border and to seek asylum in a different location. Also, want to pick up on the piece on complementary pathways, which I think is also an area of real focus, both in the US and in Europe. It's exciting to think of other ways to bring refugees through labor, through scholarships, through other means. So that's all really good. But I think we also need to ensure that we are not just cherry picking the people that we want to have come into our countries, and that we remind ourselves that resettlement is needs-based, right? And that the people that are referred for resettlement are some of the most vulnerable. And we still have an obligation to take those people who are the most vulnerable. So in terms of numbers, definitely very excited about the increase in the United States to 62,500 this year, hopefully up to 125,000 next fiscal year. I think that's tremendous progress. I think on the EU side, we would like to see resettlement numbers of 250,000 for the next 5 years. We think that Europe is able to do that. That's really not a lot, and it would actually be less than what Victoria just mentioned for Germany alone. So I think that is definitely an area where we would like to see an increase. And then also not to forget that when people refugees arrive in these countries to be resettled, right? They have very particular needs. Sometimes I talk to people who basically assume that once a refugee arrives in the United States or in Germany or wherever they are, that everything has been sorted out and now they'll have a wonderful life and it's all over. And it's not. These people often come from very difficult situations, have been through very difficult experiences, and they need the right level of support to be able to integrate successfully in their new society. And that includes having programs that are specifically designed, for example, for refugee women, or for unaccompanied minors, or for people who have mental health conditions. So we must not forget about that needs-based approach, and the fact that we need to ensure that we have the right type of programming to address those issues. So I think I'll leave it there for now. Thanks, Helena.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. What I'm hearing is that a couple of concerns or questions in terms of what would this transatlantic cooperation look like in practice? What are the concrete steps that need to be taken both in the coming months as well as possibly developed over the coming years to really ensure that these actions are followed through on? I'd like to offer the speakers a chance to come in and comment on these insights that were made for about 1 to 2 minutes. So Marta, I'd be happy to turn over to you again.
Okay, I've made a note of 6 different things that I wanted to touch on, so I'm going to talk fast to do it in 1 to 2 minutes, just based on other panelists and on Victoria and Jennifer's comments. So first of all, on refugee resettlement, nearly 3.5 million refugees in our 40-year history have been safely and securely resettled in the United States. And, of course, we see that they have made tremendous contributions to their new home communities throughout the United States. And as was mentioned, the president's emergency presidential determination was the target for fiscal year 21 was 62,500. My bureau funds, the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration supervises and funds an overseas network of resettlement support centers. And we have cooperative agreements with about 200 affiliated offices across the United States. So we're very pleased to be a part of this, and we welcome opportunities to work with the EU on resettlement. On climate change, we are committed as part of the president signed a number of executive orders related to migration. I mentioned the comprehensive approach to migration. There was another executive order also signed in February that touched on both refugee resettlement and on climate change and migration. And our bureau as well is working with the White House on part of the executive order directed us to produce a report on climate change and migration. So right now we're in the process of working together to draft this comprehensive report on the intersection of climate change, migration, particularly protection for those impacted, foreign assistance, and the things that were mentioned on resilience and adaptation. All are very much a part of what we are looking at. There are a number of other things. Let me I'll tick off some of the quicker ones. So Jennifer mentioned aid and not just a focus on border controls, and that is very much as part of the root causes strategy. The president has requested $4 billion as part of this to actually not just focus on preventing, but to actually focus on building the conditions in those countries so people will have hope and opportunity in their countries. Victoria mentioned hoping that migration is not a boutique issue or just something that we focus on for now in the transatlantic relationship. And I think with more than 80 million people on the move, internally displaced or displaced, I think that this is something that it will not kind of be a trendy thing that will go away. And finally, complementary pathways. I think that was Jennifer that mentioned. And yes, completely agree. And when we look at these legal pathways, we are looking at family reunification. We're looking at temporary workers. We're looking at refugees, asylum seekers, resettlers. So it is not it is kind of a vast, a broad scope of people with all different reasons for migrating. We're just trying to get these in a legal framework so that people are not forced into the dangers of moving irregularly. I'll pass to Johannes. Over.
Yeah, please, Johannes, over to you for any brief comments you might have.
Thank you very much. I will also speak very quickly on Victoria's comments. I think she's right that the US-EU agenda is vast. I mean, there is airplane producers, subsidiaries, and all kinds of different subjects. I think migration will stay on the agenda. It will stay on the agenda, at least in the European Union, for demographic reasons. If you look at the demography of our African partners and our own demography, it is clear it will stay on the agenda very clearly. In the most immediate future, for instance, the organized withdrawal now from Afghanistan and its potential consequences are very, very high on the agenda in the European Union. So I think that will continue. It's clear that we discuss other issues such as security issues, such as external border opening, post-COVID, and so on. But migration will definitely stay on the agenda. Just on a personal note, I found your ideas of resettlement coalitions very, very inspiring. And I think coming together also means to hopefully set an example in whatever way we can do that, the US and the EU, and to inspire each other, but also inspire others internationally to step up to the plate and do the necessary. On Greece, I just wanted to react. We are not only looking at the situation, the president has asked for the creation of a task force with a dedicated high-level official at my level, and that's my colleague who is actually just in Greece as we speak, trying to move forward accommodation that is worth the name. So things might not go as fast as we wish; they never do. but we're definitely there, and attention is being given down to the last detail. So we are looking, I can reassure you, we are looking at that physically every day. On resettlement, just to avoid any misunderstandings, our talent partnership scheme is not part of resettlements. And for the EU, of course, resettlement is something that our member states do voluntarily. However, what we have done in our new financing rules is first to increase the contribution we can make from the EU budget quite significantly, and also to cover humanitarian admission, which we didn't cover in the past. So I hope that that will also help and encourage member states on the 9th of July at the conference to make more pledges for the year 2022. Thanks.
Thanks so much. And now, Liz, I'd love to hand over to you for your reactions.
Sure. Well, I already had the opportunity, I think, to react to Marta and Johannes, so I don't have a huge amount to add. I'm interested in that idea of the transatlantic relationship not being able to incorporate migration. Having also in a previous life worked on the Transatlantic Council for Migration, it's certainly been a deep part of some conversations, but I agree they're not necessarily mainstreamed conversations. And this is where the opportunity lies now, which is to bring migration into those broader conversations that have deep relevance for it, whether it's addressing conflict and instability in key hotspots, whether it's thinking about climate and adaptation and what our next steps are, integrating then, here we have, in terms of cross-border mobility in the future, post-pandemic, we're bringing together tourism industries, trade, we're bringing together business, a lot of different constituencies, and knitting that together in a conversation, I think there's a huge opportunity there. And the transatlantic relationship will be absolutely key in that context. So I think there are a lot of opportunities to really anchor it more deeply and broadly, and build that up then so that it is sustainable in the future and it fluctuates less. And I just wanted to come back because we often talk about investing in border management as opposed to doing development work or support. At IOM, I think we also see, in addition to the opportunities for regular pathways and trying to build up that mobility to and from the US and Europe from outside, border management can also be an integrated tool in terms of development and building up regional mobility. And I think here we see a huge opportunity to build up regional mobility within the African continent, within the Americas, to really think about how you facilitate mobility through effective integration of border management and development considerations. And I think that's particularly important in a context where local cross-border mobility to support livelihoods has been shown to be extremely important in some parts of the world, and to be very important to allow people to stay in that region and stay in that locality, as opposed to feeling like they have to move on. And so we should sort of, rather than see it as a zero-sum game, something that is more deeply integrated into development considerations going forward. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Liz. I'm very pleased now to open the floor to questions from the audience, and I already see we have a couple. So I'm going to take 2 or 3 at a time, and then I'd welcome all speakers to comment. So the first question that we have relates to climate-induced displacement. And the question is, what concrete actions could the United States and the EU take in relation to climate-induced migration, and how could they cooperate more strongly in this area? The question relates to specific actions and whether these will be mitigated whether these will be focused on mitigating the effects of climate change, or whether the goal of this joint effort on addressing climate-induced migration and forcible displacement is also a way to promote durable solutions similar to those needed for refugees, such as resettlement. We also have another question on the link between sort of public support as well as the effectiveness of returns. So the question is generally, how could the EU and the US work together to effectively increase the rate of returns from their respective places, and how could this possibly also have an effect on public support for these migration agendas that are currently being negotiated and debated. And then I also have a final question, which perhaps relates more to a point that you made, Liz, which is a question on the risk that the implementation of the Global Compact on Migration, that there's risks in increasing gaps between the so-called global north and south, unless the quote unquote global north invests greater efforts to address shortcomings. So the question is, from a global migration governance perspective, what role is there for the EU and the US to play to further implementation should the US become a signatory to the Global Compact on Migration? I'd maybe follow the speaking order. So Marta, if you'd like to come in first, and then I'll turn to Johannes, Liz, and everyone else. So please, over to you.
Thanks, Helena. So on climate, so I'll just very quickly on all three. So on climate, so as I had mentioned, we're pulling together this report. Even though the report is still in draft and not finalized, we really have had a lot of discussions with civil society. We've had a lot of discussions within the interagency in the United States with the White House and so forth. And it is clear that the focus will be protection for the impacted, foreign assistance, engaging multilaterally to kind of harness our collective power to address climate change. And so, we're dedicated to using support for building resilience to the impacts of natural disasters and climate change, humanitarian relief and development, and assistance efforts all in a complementary manner to prevent, to mitigate, to enhance resilience to these complex man-made and natural disasters also that contribute to forced displacement and irregular migration. And I think that this is certainly an area that we can work very closely with our European partners on. In terms of increasing rates of returns to increase public support, I think that this is a challenge we are all facing, and I understand where it's coming from. I think that we are very much looking at this in the United States. This is not really the State Department's bailiwick. This is the Department of Homeland Security. So I don't want to step on their toes, but we are. I know that this is something that they are working to address, and I agree that the public prefers to see immigration done in a safe and orderly and legal way. So this really is part of the thrust of the new migration policy. And then on the Global Compact on Migration, I meant earlier to comment on that. It was mentioned in, I forget if it was, maybe it was Victoria's reaction. And so I know that there's a lot of interest in where the United States is going and what our position is on the Global Compact on Migration. So on this, we have done a lot of careful consideration as well. We've met with our colleagues in the U.S. government. We've held consultations as well with civil society organizations and others on this. And I think that shortly we will be able to clarify what our new position is on this. We are committed to facing our common challenges and to finding solutions that will improve protection of human rights and dignity of people. And the compact is grounded in principles of respect for state sovereignty, responsibility sharing, non-discrimination, respect for human rights. These are all values shared by the United States, and we're committed to working with other countries to realize them. And I think it really does jibe very well with the Biden administration's focus on promoting safe, orderly, and humane migration. So hopefully we'll shortly have more to say on that in a public forum. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Johannes, I'd be happy to hear if you had any comments.
Yeah, very quickly, I have little to add on climate, the same answer, resilience, but also, of course, our Green Deal. I mean, on climate change, prevention starts at home, not in third countries. And of course, there they have to their share as well. But I think the question goes in the answer of quote unquote climate refugees. I think it's an interesting subject, but sometimes I think it's a bit misguided, because what we have observed is that in the fragile countries where that is a factor, at any rate, it leads to conflict. And in the end, whether you look at Yemen, few other examples, you will have genuine refugees as defined right now. So I think we need to try and build, and for the EU we have the Green Deal, which we also proposing to third countries in our development partnerships to implement that. On returns, I found the formulation interesting that the EU has a low return rate. I mean, return rate is of course a mutual thing, and I think the formulation is partially justified. What I'm interested in is an exchange of views, an exchange of analysis of how we can make more and more migration orderly and legal, and how we best deal with returns. And I think there clearly it's also the bully pulpit, if you will, that the US has when it comes to places like Afghanistan and the status Afghanis have. That will be very very important. But at the technical level, it's really to exchange experiences about specific countries and what works and what doesn't work. Because as I said in the beginning, we are convinced that, you know, giving somebody 2,000 euros and then send them home and say good luck, that's not what voluntary return should be about. We need also the people on the ground, the communities they come from, a different perspective, if indeed we are serious about root causes. And there I think we have a lot also to learn from the US.
Thanks very much. Liz, I'd be happy to turn to you next if you'd like to come in.
Thanks very much. And I think these are really all very interesting follow-up questions. I mean, I think there are so many things you can do when it comes to responses then to climate-induced migration. And obviously mitigating climate change is core to that, right? And that's the major overarching concern, particularly at COP26. IOM is just in the process of finalizing our climate strategy, which is really thinking about the different ways in which IOM already does provide support and wishes to increase that support in the future. And it bases around three quite simple strategic objectives. One is helping people to stay. So doing that kind of community work and resilience building that gives people choice and opportunity. That doesn't force people to stay, but it also doesn't force people to move. So really thinking about how to do their adaptation work. The second principle is helping people to move. So when that choice is made to move, that choice, there are opportunities to move safely and legally, and really think through what those solutions look like, particularly for countries and regions where there may be very few other options. And then the third principle is helping people who are already on the move, who are those vulnerable migrants and displaced persons who are already moving due to climate change and need some form of response. So it's not assuming that there's a one-size-fits-all approach, but also recognizing that climate change is already having impacts, as Jennifer pointed out. And to give you a quick piece of data, last year the IDMC estimated that 30.7 million people across 149 countries were displaced due to disasters. Now that's a significant number of people already on the move. So we have to think about our responses in order to support those people and what that dynamic then is for an entire country in a situation where a large number of people are suffering both socioeconomically, but then in terms of future development. But we'll also see that accelerate in the future. So I think it's having a comprehensive approach that takes all different situations into account and accepts that to move or not to move is not a binary consideration, and that context matters, I think will be super important. I think on return and reintegration, I can focus much more on how do you make reintegration successful, and IOM has a lot of experience here in terms of building entrepreneurship programs and skilling, really thinking about whole of community efforts. So you're not just giving someone cash to go home, but you're thinking about how the whole community reacts to returns. And bringing in that broader development perspective of understanding what's already happening within a national development plan and building a return program, a reintegration program that fits well with that really focuses on long-term sustainability. And this is key. It's not simple to do. And again, it means no one size fits all, but I think it's extremely important. And on the Global Compact on Migration, I think, the risk of a North-South divide has been ever present. And so much of the global conversation over the last 15 years, if you look at the Global Forum on Migration and Development, if you look at all the various regional discussions, that tension is always in the background. But I think there are areas where at the International Migration Review Forum next year can really bring out common interest. And here climate is an obvious area of work where everyone has an interest and everyone is impacted. I think we're seeing this increasingly year on year, but also other issues that have come through during the pandemic, such as access to health. I think there is a common public health interest in really thinking about how migrants and people on the move access health services, for example, and how that functions, whether at the hard end, when we're talking about vaccination programming, or the sort of health, the broader health situation of people on the move. And then foundational issues that play into so many other aspects of safe, orderly, and legal migration, such as legal identity and access to legal identity and documentation, and these sorts of issues, which are so challenging in many countries, and really then lead into access to services, allow people the ability to move without concern, and reduces the risk of irregular migration where people may be exploited during that journey. So just a few ideas of drawing out those places where all states have an interest in moving forward and trying to step away from that North-South divide a little bit may be very productive in this early stage.
Thanks very much, Liz, for elaborating on all these points. Victoria, I know you've done a lot of work on return, so I'm expecting you to have some thoughts on this. So yeah, please, over to you.
Thanks for putting me on the spot. That was exactly what I was going to reply on, because I have worked on returns, deportations, and reintegration, both in the US context and in the German context quite extensively. So I have one comment on the question as it was posed and then answer it. So the question as it was posed said, US government seems to have a deliberate policy of enforcing repatriations only to a limited extent. And I do want to point out, yes, the United States again now has enforcement priorities, which it abandoned during the Trump administration, and they've returned to those enforcement priorities. The catchphrase that is used there usually is felons, not families. So in other words, the idea is that you have a limited amount of resources and you do want to focus it on the people that either have, that actually pose a threat to society or that have only very recently crossed into the United States. So that is the rationale between this, this deliberate policy of enforcing repatriations in a more targeted manner. And the same, in fact, can be said of a lot of EU countries, including Germany. So I think that in itself might not be a negative thing, even though it was phrased a little bit as a negative thing. But how can we work on returns? How can cooperation on returns look like in practice? Liz already mentioned a very important area, which is that of reintegration. And I do think that there is a lot of investments of the European Union in reintegration, also because there is the greater focus on assisted voluntary return and reintegration programs in the European Union compared to the United States. But the United States also does things like that. It also invests in reintegration, especially in Central America. But the exchange of the countries on that area so far has been, I want to say zilch, but that would be a little too informal. So I'll just say it has been limited. So it would be really nice to expand that. especially in one area, and that is returnee networks, because the power of former returnees to help new returnees actually reintegrate into their home countries is something that is not harvested to the degree necessary. And that is a very easy area where the two could actually cooperate on. A second area, and perhaps that's more to the spirit of the question, where of course there could be some learning happening in the area of returns, is that of conditionality. And that is a big debate that we have in the European Union of how to employ all the tools in the European Union toolbox to cooperate with countries of origin in many areas, including on return. And there, the United States has a longer experience of actually employing all those different tools in its toolbox. Now, a lot of people will say we shouldn't repeat their mistakes. But independently of whether you think that the US has been doing this well or not well, what is true is that one can learn from the US experience, both from the mistakes and from the successes to avoid the mistakes and not repeat them. So that is an area that would be useful. And the third one that perhaps some people that care about a very high return rate don't like to hear so much, but I think is important to point out, is if you want to cooperate on returns and have a comprehensive solution, you don't just have to look at returns, but also at regularization. And that is an area where both in the United States and in Germany and Europe more broadly, there has been a great debate about how can we open up paths to legalization, or in the US, it's paths to citizenship. Because of course it is unrealistic to actually return or deport all the people in our countries that don't have a legal right to stay. So a pragmatic and useful solution to that challenge of today consists of these two pillars. One is returns and the other is regularization. I'll leave it there.
Thanks very much, Victoria. Jennifer, over to you.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, a few points on that question about repatriation. Really want to support what Victoria just said around basically comprehensive immigration reform. That's what we're calling it here in the United States. And it is providing that path to citizenship for people who have been here for a long time, who have a track record of paying taxes and working and doing all of these things. So, I mean, that's absolutely critical. I think also the other thing is ensuring that we do have a fair system for adjudicating asylum. We know that in the United States, if you have legal representation, your chances go up exponentially than if you don't have legal representation, right? So making sure that people are able to access that. Also ensuring that the system doesn't take years. We also have a backlog. And so it can take 4 years for somebody to get their asylum hearing, which is also not helpful either for those individuals who are basically putting their life on hold for 4 years or for anybody else. And then the other point is around, you also cannot return people to areas of conflict. So that's another really key principle that we need to bear in mind when thinking about this. And finally, just wanted to support what I think Elizabeth said around having support for returnees. I remember visiting a returnee processing center in El Salvador a couple of years ago, and I spoke to several of the people who had been sent back from the United States, and they all said, oh, in a couple of weeks, I'm going to go and try again, right? So if they don't have the right level of support, if they don't have the right tools, if they don't have the right opportunities, that is what's going to happen. And then you get into this dynamic that it just repeats itself. So I think having that support on the receiving end is really critical.
Thanks very much as well for your insights. I see we have another question actually that relates to this, which is in terms of embedding reintegration within broader development objectives in host countries as well as countries of origin. And the question is, to learn more a bit about how the US and the EU are, if there are similar improvements or lessons learned that are available with regarding the strategic use of resettlement in a similar way. So it's looking at how reintegration is being embedded in broader policy approaches and how that compares to how resettlement is being framed in either context. And then I have another question that relates to a point that was made earlier, also in relation to Title 42, which is that both in Europe and the US, rules have been set in place that restrict migrants' access to asylum. How can we ensure that our protection systems become more crisis resilient and less liable to political considerations? Of course, you've also mentioned, the sort of broader reform processes, but are there any other steps that can be taken to prevent similar things from happening in the future? So I'm not sure if there's anyone who would like to come in first. Yes, Marta, please, over to you.
Okay, so in terms of reintegration as a part of broader policy, so that is very much that, when I was talking about the four components of the administration's new comprehensive approach to migration, that collaborative migration management strategy, which was the second part that I described as a component, that piece of it includes everything from surging humanitarian assistance to building asylum opportunities in the region to increasing support for the internally displaced and to really renewing our focus on reintegration support in countries. So I think it is very much understood that that reintegration is an extremely important part of the puzzle. And in terms of restricting access to asylum, I will say that one of the first things with that executive order that the president signed on migration in February that was done was there were these ACAs, these asylum cooperative agreements by which people agreements that had been reached with El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. And one of the first things that was done was to suspend and move towards termination of those three agreements. And I think the same for, as I had mentioned, the migration protection protocols, where people were pushed back into Mexico to wait for their ability to pursue their cases in immigration courts in the United States. Since the new administration began, we have engaged in a process whereby individuals who were previously part of the MPP program have been screened, and have been allowed to approach the border in an orderly and safe way. More than 12,000 individuals since February or March have entered the United States through the process that we have worked with our international partners and with our colleagues at the Department of Homeland Security. So we are very much aware of not restricting people's access to asylum, and we are trying to, as we move forward and as we grapple, hopefully, with the end of some of these restrictions due to COVID, we will see a more streamlined process. Over.
Thanks very much, Marta. Would any of the other panelists like to come in?
I would like to add something. So the first question made me think about how we could actually use some of the resources and the strategies that we use in resettlement for reintegration programs. So in resettlement, we have a number of tools that cover everything from cultural orientation when refugees come to the United States to how to use the financial system, how to what's the school system like. All of these things are part and parcel of what we do with resettlement work. There have been, certainly over the last 4 years in the United States, there were a number of people who were deported back to Central America who had been living in the United States for a long period of time, sometimes 10 years or more, right? And then we're going back to countries that they really didn't know, and where there was a certain level of cultural shock in a way, because even though they were acquainted with sort of the cultural norms, they didn't necessarily know the system in that particular country. And so in designing these programs for reintegration, there's probably quite a bit that we could take from the resettlement experience and from the technical assistance that we provide there to use them kind of almost in the reverse.
Thanks so much. Liz, please, over to you.
I just wanted to add, because I was frantically looking for it, I think IOM at the end of last week actually published our 2020 Return and Reintegration Report, which has a few initiatives in terms of taking a more rounded approach to reintegration. It was particularly challenging last year. And I think this is the key, is the need to be adaptable, not just to context, but to changing situations. And last year, IOM colleagues found it extremely challenging to work in a context of social distancing on the ground in situations where that face-to-face interaction and that constant engagement and support is extremely important. And what we saw was the adaptation then to sort of remote counseling and assistance, and trying to find workarounds to be safe and yet still manage to support. And some of those tools and assistance, I think, are really going to be interesting to see whether they can be integrated in the future and further enhance the type of support given, particularly in remote parts of the world. But I can certainly send this on if people are interested in hearing a little more about some of those shifts and some of those approaches that have been taken, particularly over the last year.
Yeah, I'm sure audience members will be very interested. So thanks very much for making a reference to that. Johannes, please, you'd like to come in. Over to you.
Yeah, thanks. I don't know where the assessment comes from that we are trying to restrict asylum. I suppose, as far as the union is concerned, it might refer to the so-called pushbacks, which is something, as most in the audience will know, we are discussing with member states, civil society, Frontex, and all the actors involved, and which we do not accept. For the rest, of course, the pact is designed exactly to distinguish those with a right for international protection or subsidiary protection from those who do not have that right, and to do that in a well-managed manner. Just one thought, but there I look more at IOM than anybody else. We talk a lot about the returnees, and that is right. But we also need to talk about their governments and what incentives they have to reintegrate people. And there, I would think that remittances play a role, apart from internal politics and political factors. But I would also be very interested to set up a triangular relationship, if you will, between the local government, the returnees, and the diaspora in the European Union, and get that going, because that diaspora could also help us a lot with reintegration efforts. So there, we will also look at IOM for good ideas of how we could do that. Thanks.
And Victoria, please, the floor is yours.
Thanks. Yes, echoing what Johannes just said, I think that's absolutely the way to go, and the whole idea of bridging and bringing in diaspora into the reintegration work, I think, is a very crucial one. We're also working with an initiative right now that consists of diaspora groups in Germany that are trying to help the reintegration efforts in countries of origin. So I think that is definitely where the conversation is kind of moving to. So it's great to see that there's an initiative happening there. But I did want to just echo what Jennifer said about learning, using strategies from resettlement in reintegration. You, Jennifer, mentioned specifically the help with pre-departure training, because people have been gone for so long that in essence they do need to have that training, kind of preparation of what they're about to get into again. I would even expand that and say another area where definitely resettlement strategies can be applied to reintegration strategies is job help, finding help with jobs and kind of livelihoods in countries of origin is as hard oftentimes for people as it is for newly resettled refugees. So I think there's a lot of parallels between those two worlds. Another parallel would be psychosocial support, something that resettled refugees, of course, as a matter of principle, should be able to access and often do in the European Union, also in the United States. But that is a lot more scarce for returnees, even though they might also have a similar need for it. So I think there's these great parallels. So thank you, Jennifer, for pointing all of them out. And in the end, very last thing I'm going to say on this is that when we look at kind of where do reintegration and broader development policy intersect, it's simply that returnees basically need whatever they needed before they set out on their migration journey as well. So if you have good development policy, that already is good reintegration policy, and vice versa. So I think these two areas are very much aligned, and therefore it would be useful if that also played a larger role in the EU-US migration cooperation going forward. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Victoria. These were really excellent remarks, and I feel like we've started from a sort of very broad and normative perspective, and we've really identified some key areas where the US and the EU could exchange views, exchange ideas on good practices, and to better understand really how, you know, greater policy coherence on a number of different issues could be achieved. I'd like to add just a couple more things because we're really coming to the close of the event. As I said, I think, you know, we started out with this broad premise that there are a number of issues that, following years of lacking engagement, that can really be picked up on, that existed beforehand, most notably in the areas of, you know, security policy, you know, data exchange, but also border management. But I think now, in light of the global challenges that we've discussed, climate-induced displacement, growing resettlement needs, and a number of other issues, there may be great opportunities for the EU and the US to increasingly incorporate this into their agendas, and to also find workable solutions, durable solutions, and to identify innovative solutions that could help address these issues in the respective geographical areas. So there's a clear indication of a convergence of interests that could only be intensified over the coming months. Of course, we've also sort of heard that there are a number of different political issues that may prove difficult to overcome. But at the same time, I think, you know, the recent exchanges and the recent meetings have shown that this partnership is off to a good start. And that if it can be maintained in this way and potentially even built up, then we will maybe even see a more progressive agenda coming up. So I'd like to thank all the speakers at this point, really, for their active contributions, for shedding light on a number of different issues, and for highlighting some issues that maybe haven't really received enough attention before, or that could be taken into the public discourse a lot more. I'd also like to thank our partners, the United States Mission to the European Union, once again for supporting this event. And finally, I would also like to thank all of you today for joining us. The EPC's migration team will be going on a bit of a summer break, but we would really encourage you to keep an eye out for events and publications coming up in the fall, notably in connection to the new pact, as well as the upcoming Slovenian presidency, amongst others. So thank you again for joining us today, and goodbye.
Thanks a lot, Helena. Goodbye.